Afternoon, good evening, wherever you are at. This is Dr. Diane Sanchez, and I'm going to review strategic HR management and planning. First of all, our learning objectives is to summarize the organization's strategic planning process, then explain the key differences between good and bad strategy, and suggest a way to force strategic asset reallocation. Outline how human resources strategies are merged with organizational strategies. Discuss how one forecasts for supply and demand of human resources. List options for handling a shortage and a surplus of employees. Identify how organizations can measure and analyze the effectiveness of human resource management practices. So first of all, let's talk about strategy and strategic planning. The definition of strategy is the proposition an organization follows for how to compete successfully and thereby survive and grow. And the strategic planning is the process of defining organizational strategy and allocating resources towards its achievement. So successful organizations really start with strategic planning because it really provides and defines where the company is going, makes decisions on how they're going to go forward, and really it is a process that successful organizations engage in on a regular basis. Now, from this figure, you can see that the strategic planning process starts with organizational mission, a SWOT analysis, establish goals and objectives, formulate organizational strategy, formulate supporting functional strategies, implementation, and then evaluation and reassess. We'll go over each of these in specific detail. The organizational mission is the guiding force and core reason for existence of the organization and what makes it unique. And I'm sure most of you think of Apple, right, as being extremely unique, and their core reason for existence is really what makes them, their technology and just making Apple part of everyday life is what makes them so unique. The strategic HR management entails providing input into organizational strategic planning and developing specific HR initiatives to help achieve the organizational goals. The next thing strategic HR management does is develops processes that will help align individual employee performance with organizational strategic objectives. Operationalizing HR management strategy. So what does it mean to think strategically as an HR practitioner? Well, you've got to do four things. Understand the business, which is knowing the financials and key drivers of the business success. And it's important to understand the need for certain strategies as it relates to the business. Focusing on key business goals, programs that have the greatest relevance to the business objectives should get priority. Knowing what to measure, that's metrics that are vital, a vital part of assessing success. And that means being able to pick the measures that directly relate to the business goals. And then preparing for the future. Thinking strategically requires preparation for the future, not just focusing on the past, but also looking for seeing what the indicators were on the past and then what will the organization do in the future. Now, areas where HR can develop strategies, you can see on this chart, and it's also in your book. I mean, we can help with the mission statement. We can help with objectives and strategies. From a strategic level, staffing is really important, total rewards, employee labor relations, training and development, performance management, and we can develop processes operationally that will support those strategies. And then, of course, measurement, effectiveness, efficiency, and legal compliance. So HR strategies for global competitiveness. What is a multinational corporation? A corporation that has facilities and other assets in at least one country other than its home country. And many of your organizations may be a multinational corporation. Offshoring, relocation of a business process or operation by a company from one country to another. And when companies do offshoring, they have to consider the reliability. Is the offshore vendor able to deliver, and is the offshore vendor able to be responsive when the organization wants to make changes? Well, here is a strategic HR approach to international staffing. And there's 4 types of approach. Ethnocentric policy, which is managers from headquarters staff key positions. And what that does is it ensures control over the subsidiary location operations. It eases transfer of policies from headquarters to the subsidiary. Then there's polycentric policy, host country national staff key positions. This reduces cultural mishaps and misunderstanding, and the coordination with a headquarters may be problematic. Regiocentric policy is key positions are filled by individuals in the region of the subsidiary, for example, European Union countries. And this capitalizes on the cultural and language similarities within the region. And then last is the geocentric policy. An international cadre of skilled managers are assigned to global subsidiaries regardless of nationality. And this really leverages technical and managerial experience. And a company like Boeing, where I worked, we had a geocentric policy where we had various managers from Asia, Brazil, Mexico, and they were highly technical, and we would put them in certain subsidiaries so that they would bring their expertise to that subsidiary. And that's an example of geocentric policy. All right, human resource planning, what is it? It's an analysis that identifies the need for and availability of people so that the organization can meet its strategic objectives. It ensures that the right number of human resources with the right capabilities at the right time in the right places. Here's a great flow chart of the process. First, we start with the organization's environmental analysis. Then we assess external and internal workforce. We compile human resource planning forecasts, and we develop the human resources staffing plans and actions. And we'll go into detail here about the human resources planning. So first we start with the environmental scanning. We assessment of the internal and external environmental conditions that might affect our organizations. So that can be economic, political, and competitive forces. Internally, we also look at, what is the quality and quantity of the talent that we have? What is the organizational culture? Is there a talent pipeline and leadership bench strength? So that's an example of, or outline of internal and external environmental scanning. It helps us identify the strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities and threats. And so here's the human resources factors in a SWOT analysis. First of all, we look for strengths. That is, our people, the intellectual capital, how committed our employees are, how innovative are they, what are the high performance practices. Weaknesses, maybe we have a lack of skilled employees. Maybe there's a lack of a leadership pipeline. We have outdated talent management practices. And then what's some of the opportunities? Well, we might have a great market position. For those of you in engineering or IT, that's great market position. Maybe there's unexplored markets like in Asia or India. Global expansion. Maybe your companies want to expand globally, and then of course technological advances. And then threats. Well, there's legal mandates and restrictions, competitor power, economic uncertainty, and then of course talent shortage. So what is succession planning? That again is something critical in your analysis, and it's a process of identifying a plan for an orderly replacement of key employees. And as we talked in Chapter 1, we have 4 generations in the workplace, and many of them, our baby boomers, are retiring. Well, we need to come up with a succession plan to ensure that those baby boomers that are exiting our organizations with all of their knowledge, skills, and abilities, that we're able to select individuals that can fill their jobs and then do knowledge transfer programs. So that's an example of a succession planning kind of process. Factors affecting external pull of employees. So, as we talked about, these kinds of things would affect the HR planning. Government regulations, tax legislation at the local, state, and federal levels, geographic and competitive evaluations, direct competitors, international competition, and then of course, like I talked about, the changing workforce, aging workforce, growing diversity of workers. At our last census, 16% of the population was Hispanic. It is estimated by 2040 that it'll be 40% of the workforce. Again, we talked about female workers. 50% of the workforce is women, and we have to balance their work-life concerns, the availability of contingent workers, and possibly outsourcing possibilities. So planning for internal workforce audit. That's what is our current and future job audit is really key for us to find out what is our internal workforce. So what jobs exist now and how essential is each job? How many individuals are performing each job? What are the reporting relationships of the jobs? What are the vital knowledge, skills, and abilities needed in the jobs? What jobs will be needed to implement future organizational strategies? And what are the characteristics of those anticipated jobs? Then we complete an employee and organizational capabilities inventory, and this is usually done through your HRIS program, but it documents employee demographics, their age, their length of service in the organization, their time in their present job, and then their individual career progression, the jobs that they held, the time in each job, the education that they had, the training levels they had, the promotions and other job changes and their pay rates. And then we capture individual performance data. What did they accomplish at work? What were their growth in skills? How are their working relationships? So all that is necessary data when we're planning for internal workforce audit and availability. Then we do forecasting, which is using information from the past and the present to identify expected future conditions. And we do it in 2 ways. We do it in the judgmental methods and we do it in the mathematical methods. First of all, let's discuss judgmental methods. We can estimate, and that is really, estimates can be either top down or bottom up, but essentially people who are in a position to know are asked, how many people will you need next year? The rule of thumb method relies on general guidelines applied to a specific situation within an organization. So, for example, a guideline of 1 operations manager per 5 reporting supervisors. That can aid in the number of supervisors needed for a division. The Delphi technique uses input from a group of experts whose opinions of forecasted situations are sought. These expert opinions are then combined and returned to the experts for a second anonymous opinion. So the process continues through several rounds until the experts, essentially agree on how many employees they may need for a specific position. And then nominal groups. It's unlike the Delphi method. It requires experts to meet face to face. Their ideas may be cited independently at first. It's discussed as a group and then compiled into one report. So those are the 4 examples of judgmental methods. Then there's the mathematical methods for forecasting. Statistical regression analysis makes a statistical comparison of past relationships among various factors. So, for example, a statistical relationship between gross sales and the number of employees in a retail chain may be useful in forecasting the number of employees that will be needed if the retail sales increases 15% or decreases 10%. Simulation models are representations of real situations in abstract form. So, for example, an econometric model of the growth in software usage would lead to forecast of the need for software developers. Productivity ratios calculates the average number of units produced per employee. These averages can be applied to sales forecasts to determine the number of employees needed. So, for example, a firm could forecast the number of needed sales representatives using these ratios. And then staffing ratios can be used to estimate indirect labor. For example, if a company usually uses 1 clerical person for every 25 production employees, that ratio can be used to estimate the need for clerical employees. All right, HR forecasting planning periods. There's 3 of them. Short-term ranges, which is forecast for immediate HR needs of the organization. Intermediate range plans, which project 1 to 3 years into the future, and then long range plans, extended beyond 3 years. Most of the long range plans are really things like pharmaceutical companies where they're thinking about future drugs. Intermediate range plans mostly are companies that are in manufacturing, potentially sales. So it just depends on what your company has said, really forecasts when they're going to have changes in their organization. Forecasting external supply for employees. So these are all of the things that we look out externally to see if there is a supply. And so net migration into and out of the area. So it might be your area, a state, maybe like in Texas. What is the migration in and out of the Texas area if I need to look for employees? Individuals entering and leaving the workforce. Individuals graduating from schools and colleges. The changing workforce composition and patterns. Economic forecasts for the next few years. Technological developments and shifts, actions of competing employers, and government regulations. All this information is done by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And The government estimates labor populations on a regular basis. You can get this data either by city, state, or even geographic area. And if you go to bls.gov, you can look at all of these kinds of measures. Then we estimate internal labor supply for a given unit. So what is our current staffing? And then what are we projecting for the outflows this year? So who's going to get promoted? Who's going to leave the organization? How much turnover do we have? What will be the demotions, the retirements, potential deaths and layoffs? And then we add that to the inflows for the year. What are we thinking of? How many external hires are we going to make? How many internal transfers from other departments or other subsidiaries? What kind of promotions do you think we're going to have? And then recalls. That then gives us the internal supply for the next year of our staffing. Now this slide gives you a great outline of managing talent, either a surplus or when you have a talent shortage. And so on the left side, when you have a talent surplus, there's things companies can do to reduce the workforce, and that can be, reduce employee work hours or reduce cost or reduce compensation, hiring freezes, regular attrition, voluntary separation programs, and of course a downsizing. On the right is when you have a talent shortage, and these are things companies would do. Increase employee work hours through overtime, outsource to a third party, implement alternative work arrangements, use contingent workers like temporaries, and reduce employee turnover. So these are all techniques we use when we are managing a talent supply. Best practices to carry off layoffs, that is when we have an overage of talent. And anybody that's been part of a layoff knows how sensitive it becomes. And best practices to carry out layoffs, whether they are best practices or not, there is a huge emotional effect on the organization. But we need to identify the work that is core to sustaining a profitable business. So those are the positions that you want to keep. We identify the knowledge, skills, and abilities and competencies needed to execute the business strategy. We protect the bottom line and the corporate brand, and we're constantly communicating with our employees. And we pay attention to the survivors, because once the downsizing has happened or the layoff has happened, it's just as much an emotional experience for the survivors who stay at the organization. So we have to pay attention to their emotional needs at the time. Severance benefits and outplacement services. This is again a great best practice. We can give severance agreements that really just provides for the employees to ease the financial burden. We can provide them outplacement services such as personal career counseling, resume preparation, interviewing workshops, and then referral assistance. Now, legal considerations when we're doing a layoff. And there are a couple of laws that we need to be concerned about. That is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, age discrimination, and Americans with Disabilities. We'll go into detail about that in the next chapter. Then we provide COBRA benefits. That's medical benefits for the individuals that are laid off. They are eligible to carry their medical benefits on for 18 months. Older worker protection, that provides for older workers when they get a severance agreement, they're given 45 days to review their severance agreement if they're over the age of 40 before they consider waiving their right to sue. The Older Worker Protection Act also requires employers to disclose the ages of both terminated and retained employees in layoff situations. So that's really very important. It takes an analysis. And then Worker Adjustment Retraining Notification, the WARN Act. The WARN Act is a law that requires private and commercial organizations that employ employees of 100 or more a 60-day notice. So this is very important because we give the WARN Act notice when there's a potential layoff, and there's heavy fines if employers do not follow this required process. Managing a talent shortage. We talked about this a little bit, but alternative work arrangements, that is just providing non-traditional schedules to provide flexibility for employees, such as job sharing or telecommuting. We talked about outsourcing, transferring the management and performance of a business function to an external service provider. And this is another ways to manage a talent shortage. First, of course, use overtime, but overtime can only go so far because your employees will really need time off, and your productivity could go down if you really overutilize overtime. Second is outsourcing the work. Third is trying to find alternative work arrangements. Fourth, bringing back recent retirees. A lot of the healthcare providers are doing that with nurses and doctors. Increasing the contingent worker, and then trying to reduce the turnover that's occurring. Now, let's jump into human resources and what we do during mergers and acquisitions. And I was lucky enough to be part of a due diligence team at one of the organizations that I worked for, and it was an amazing experience where we really did analysis of what the company we were buying, their benefits, their compensation, their salaries, their pensions, and so it was a wonderful experience. If any of you get a chance to be part of a due diligence team, it's a great experience. So due diligence is a comprehensive assessment of all the aspects of the business that's being acquired. So financial, sales, marketing. And then you're identifying risks and possible conflicts for the merged company. Then you have an integration period, which is addressing all the processes, retaining the key talent, and recognizing cultural differences. And like I said, I was lucky enough to be part of a great merger that had all three of these areas. And then post-integration, optimizing the workforce, identifying the new culture. So we talked about due diligence. Here's what HR professionals review: legal compliance, compensation and benefits. What is the talent in those organizations? What's the labor contracts and the obligations the company would have when the merger occurred? And it's even more complex when you are merging or acquiring a company from different countries. Then it's the organizational change, which to me is the most difficult. Once the merger has occurred, it's the integration of the organizational culture that is the hardest part from my perspective. You really have to define the desired behaviors, and like I said, this was probably the most fun I had but when we did the merger, but it was the most difficult and the most time-consuming. And that's because we had to provide behavioral examples of how people are expected to act now that the merged company is together. Now remember, cultures, in companies are very different. One company may be very paternalistic and the other company may be extremely market sales driven. I mean, you've got two different cultures that you're bringing together, so you have to define the desired behaviors that you're going to want the new employees or the employees to act. And then you need to deploy role models. You select leaders who exemplify those desired behaviors and make them visible throughout the organization. Then you provide meaningful incentives. You reward those role models with recognition and reinforce their behavior to signal to the rest of the organization that that's the kind of behaviors that we should model in the combined company. And then provide clear and consistent messages, aligning what you say with what you do, and reward it. So, like I said, if any of you go through any kind of merger, this integration of the culture is really, for me, the most difficult. Measuring the effectiveness of human capital. And how do we do that? We do that by effectiveness and efficiency, the ability to produce a specific desired effect or result that can be measured, and then the efficiency, the degree to which operations are done in an economical manner. HR metrics and analytics. HR metrics are specific measures tied to HR performance indicators, and HR analytics is an evidence-based approach to making HR decisions on the basis of quantitative tools and models. So let's dive into these. These are on figure 2.11 on this slide is key HR metrics. And Saratoga Institute, or the PwC Saratoga Institute, is a phenomenal resource for providing key measure metrics. They have several, I think over 100 metrics that HR practitioners use. But these are just some. HR staff and expenses, HR to employee ratio. That's, some companies will say, we'll have one HR person for every 200 employees. That's what HR to employee ratio is. Staffing, the number of positions filled, time to fill, cost per hire. And then in compensation, annual wage and salary increases, payroll and benefits cost to the percentage of payroll or to operating expenses. Hours of training per employee, total cost of training. Retention and quality is, the average tenure of employees and the percentages of new hires that are retained after 90 days. Some companies do 120 days. Some companies do a year. Development, positions filled internally. So these are just key HR metrics that HR departments use. Characteristics of HR metrics and analytics. Well, first of all, you've got to have accurate data. And usually that's from your human resources information system, your HRIS system. But it's got to be accurate. And the measures have to be linked to strategic and operational objectives. They've got to be clearly understood calculations. And they've got to be valued by your executives. And the results need to be compared both internally and externally. And you can benchmark external companies that are same in your industry. And then the measurement data drive HR management efforts. So HR benchmarking and the Balance Scorecard. About 10 years ago, the Balance Scorecard came out, and it really highlighted the elements of the Balance Scorecard. But from an HR perspective, what we can do is we benchmark comparing businesses and their results to industry standards. So if you're in the healthcare industry, you're going to benchmark with other healthcare companies. If you're in the airline industry, you're benchmarking other airlines. Same thing the HR people benchmark their compensation, their benefits, their pensions, their policies and procedures. And then we use the Balance Scorecard to report a diverse set of performance measures. So here in Figure 2.12, the Balance Scorecard framework is really driven by your vision and your strategy. So let's talk about financial measures. Traditional financial measures such as profit and loss, operating margins, utilization of capital, return on investment, return on assets. These are needed to make sure that the organization is managing its bottom line effectively. Internal business processes, product and service quality, efficiency, productivity, conformance with standards, cycle times can be measured to ensure that the operations run smoothly and efficiently. Customer satisfaction or customer relations includes customer satisfaction, loyalty, and retention are important to ensure that the organization is meeting customer expectations and can depend on repeat business from its customers. And lastly, learning and growth activities. This is employee training and development, mentoring programs, succession planning, knowledge creation and sharing, which provides the necessary talent and human capital to ensure that the future of the organization is going to be sustained. So this is what a balanced scorecard framework looks like, and the different metrics you use is dependent on each of these areas. So for human capital effectiveness measures, there's 4 big ones: return on investment, human capital value added, human capital return on investment, human capital value added, human economic value added. And the details are in your book, but we all know ROI. Every CFO, every finance department is going to ask you, what is the ROI on this training? What is the ROI on your benefits? What is the ROI on all your activities? So that's a standard one. And then under human capital, these 3 are pretty big ones that we can use as effectiveness measures. Here's the ROI calculation. Really, it's value of gains from productivity improvement for a time period over operating costs for a new or enhanced system for a time period plus one-time costs of acquisition and implementation. And here is the calculations for human capital effective measures. And again, these detail in your book, so I suggest you read it in detail. Now, lastly, the human resources audit. And really, it's formal research effort to assess the current state of your human resources practices, and these are the areas that we audit. Staffing, compensation, health and safety, legal compliance, administrative processes, employee retention and benefits. And these are the audit levels we can do. Compliance audit, so we're checking record keeping, both state and federal paperwork requirements. We're checking benefit programs, and that's going to be even more enhanced with our new, what everybody has coined, Obamacare. We're going to review the regulatory compliance and benefits administration, which that law states we must do on a regular basis. I-9 audits, reviewing the immigration regulation and the I-9 paperwork that comes with all that. And then, of course, specific program audits. We'll review specific areas such as compensation, EEO. And then, of course, a full audit, which I highly recommend companies do every 2 years so that they stay in full compliance. So I hope you have found this webinar helpful. As always, please post your questions to the discussion board. Thank you for attending.